Okay, so starting with the article condensing things down. So for this, we're kind of looking at like a continuation of the narrative that we were talking about last week for marriage and family. And what I mean by that is we were looking at basically, we were looking at changes in families at a very like macro level, right? So we're looking at it very much so at the level of large sort of historical and geographic differences in how families are structured. But that doesn't really get us into the present very well when it comes to those other places. And that's kind of what our article here is doing. So, did anybody catch where this article takes place?
Sub-Saharan Africa.
Do people know what that means?
Below the Sahara.
Yeah, exactly. Sub-Saharan means below the Sahara Desert, right? So, usually what you think about when you think of Africa is Sub-Saharan Africa. The northern part, partially because of the influence of like early Islamic empires, is culturally more similar to the Middle East than it is to Sub-Saharan Africa, and that's why you often see people make that divide. So Sub-Saharan Africa. Did anybody catch what country in Sub-Saharan Africa it is? Does the actual study takes place?
Mozambique?
Yep, it's in Mozambique. Does anybody know where that is?
In Africa.
Well, that's not very descriptive. I mean, Africa's bigger than North America and Europe combined, so.
Southern Africa.
What's that?
Southern Africa.
Yeah, it's pretty far down in the southern tip of Africa. It's not too South Africa, but it's close to. Okay, so before colonization, right? Because when we were talking before, and we were talking about other cultures, we were talking about them as if they were sort of independent, floating out in space. But really, what we've seen in terms of changes in marriages worldwide is that there's been a huge influence of colonialism, right? Because if places become taken over, a lot of cultural change occurs, right? Families don't look the same as they used to. So, love match marriages in the Western model might be common in a place like India, where traditionally they're not practiced, right? And monogamous marriages are very common in Sub-Saharan Africa, even though prior to colonization, the cultural ideal would have been for a polygamous marriage. So basically this article is looking at, in the current context, how is it that religion and marital practice interact? So, we have a tendency too to think, does anybody know what religion is most commonly practiced in Southern Africa? Anybody want to venture a guess?
Christianity.
Christianity, yeah. Does anybody know what the largest denomination of Christianity in Southern Africa is? Or really in Sub-Saharan Africa in general? No. Catholicism. So most people from Africa are Catholic. It's probably the largest single group. Then there's different Protestant denominations after that. Mozambique in particular was a French colony, right? And so Mozambique is largely Catholic, still to this day. There's usually when people talk about traditional religions haven't completely died out in Africa, but usually they've merged with Christianity in some form. So usually there's some form of syncretism, either Christianity or Islam. Pretty much everybody on the continent of Africa, for the most part, practices Christianity or Islam. And actually the rates of religiosity are significantly higher than those in most of the world. So they are people who very much so practice their religion. So kind of, if you think about it, that kind of seems like an odd thing that polygamy would be super common, and then primarily it would be composed of, a group of people that you would assume would be somewhat hostile to it, right? So that's kind of what the article is looking at. And to get us into this in a summary sort of fashion, I'm going to have, for the last time in this course, you guys look at a statistical chart. Last time, if you don't remember how to look at them from now on. Okay. Oh, there we go. Oh, I didn't watch me now. It talked too long. Shut down. Well, how about you guys just turn to page 759? I can't see this front one, it's not working. Yeah, let's go ahead. Okay. So I'm going to have you guys, you see that table 4? The second chart? So first of all, whenever you go to read a chart, what's the best place to start? What do you want to look at first? The asterisk. Well, even before that. You're going to want to look at the asterisks and negative and positive. What do you need to know before you do that?
What the table is studying, or like what the data?
Yeah, what the variables are, right? Yeah, so what's the best place to start with that, do you think?
Title.
The title! So what's the title of our graph? Yeah, go ahead.
Denominational variations in the likelihood of being in a polygamous union and the perception of acceptability of polygamous marriage in the church.
Okay.
Household.
Oh, yeah. So so we're looking at two different variables, right, on our chart. What are the two variables?
The denomination category and the age category.
So one of them we're looking at is denomination, right? What's the other side? So denomination is what you're going to find here, right? What's the other side? What's the other variable? What happens along the top? What are the two variables that were in the title? So denominations compared to what?
As compared to Chicago household?
What's that?
As compared to Chicago household?
Well, that's the place that they're doing the study. It's just the district within Mozambique. It's comparing, are people polygamous, and what do they perceive their church's attitudes towards polygamy are. Okay, so as we already got from when I was trying to get the title, is the thing you should look at first. We look at the asterisks and the plus or minus. So where do we see the asterisks? Where do we see correlations? Yeah, go ahead.
In Roman Catholic, or I'm going to be flowers of perception and acceptability. And then mainline Protestant, actually it looks like the entire B column.
The entire B column? Oh, yeah, the entire B column. Yeah, for the most part. So what kind of correlations are those? Yeah, they're negative correlations, right? So what do we see? What does that mean? There's what's the relationship like between people's basically perceptions, people's attitudes towards which denominations? Inverse, yeah. So for every single Christian denomination, someone belonging to that church, right, changes, right, their perception of the acceptability of polygamy. Right? Makes sense. So everybody at all the churches agrees what? About polygamy.
Not acceptable.
It's not acceptable. Okay. What about the other line then? What about column A? What's that? Oh, so you can ignore the BNS thing. Yeah, I'm just because basically one is going to be a number from which they use to derive the correlation. The other is basically a derivative of the standard deviation. And you don't need to know that. If you want to know how to read that part of it, you got to fix that out, basically. And then usually the numbers are actually mean most of them. Right? So, anyways. Where that would become significant is just if you were running the tests on the same data, you'd be able to tell whether they ran their test properly by whether you got the same numbers they did. So that's all that they would use that for. So it's just basically people sharing that information. But even normally when people read them, they don't pay attention to it. So. Okay, so what's column A about? I'm going to try to drag this out of you guys still.
If people practice polygamy or not.
Whether people practice it or not. What correlates on column A?
Apparently not Catholicism. The only religion that correlates with practicing polygamy is apostolic, and that's inverse correlation.
Yeah, so basically, what you end up with is, and actually Catholicism kind of does. That cross thing is a lesser correlation, so it kind of does. Right? But the idea, yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. So why is Zionist, why is it in brackets? On the
Yeah. So if we look at the breakdown of the different, so the Zionistic apostolic churches, those are specifically African denominations. So that's the difference there. And I'll get into why that's significant stuff. So don't. So yeah, basically, so one thing that we could say from looking at this chart is what? What people believe doesn't really seem to have much of a relationship to what they do. And that's actually a pretty interesting phenomenon, right? So people who don't really think that polygamy is acceptable still practice polygamy in their culture, right? So in some ways, out of the sort of thrust of tradition, they're still practicing it, even though they think that they should. Which is pretty interesting. So and basically part of that is if you go through the article, a lot of that is the way in which economic need, as well as the economic structure surrounding the marriage practices, reinforces polygamy. So even though people feel like they probably shouldn't practice it, there's still that incentive to do so. Okay, and then this gets us into how do they manage to justify that? So not all of, so there's within Mozambique and within a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, you have competing denominations, just like you do in most of the countries where there's Christianity, right? And so if we look at these the different denominations and where we see correlations and where we don't, they actually have a lot to do with who tolerates polygamous marriages. So in other words, in some ways, when people compete over people becoming a part of their religion in Mozambique, looking the other way when congregates decide to take on a second or third wife is actually part of the draw of certain religious communities. So increasingly, denominations have stepped back from criticizing it out of hopes of keeping members. right? And that's mainly modeled after those, so when you pointed out the Zionistic thing, right? A lot of the Zionistic churches are not particularly hostile to polygamous marriages because they often involve some sort of syncretism with traditional religion. So other denominations are increasingly modeling themselves after that, right? And essentially accepting polygamous marriages. So it's showing how this conversation basically allows this practice to continue forward into time. Even though on the surface, having 300 years of Christian, having been converted to Christianity seems like it probably should have done that. Does that make sense? So that's just sort of taking our last week, and I want to make sure we have enough time to kind of get into the other article, but essentially that's taking our last week's discussion, right, and continuing it into the title. Okay, any questions or thoughts on that? Since we couldn't get it working. I was just going to use that for the statistical chart anyways. So, okay, to get into our discussion of sexual and romantic relationships sexual and romantic relationships in young adulthood, I think it's useful to think about how we normally want to ask questions about particularly sexual practices that we sometimes feel uncomfortable about with, versus how a sociologist is probably going to ask those same questions. Okay, so a lot of times when we think about particularly like questions about things like sexual promiscuity, people want, the debate looks something like, are people more promiscuous than they used to be? And you maybe hear people make comments about like, how are sexual practices changing, right? A lot of the time you hear this sort of discussion and it's basically like, are things getting worse or are they getting better, right? I think that framing causes a lot of misunderstanding. And one of it is that it's difficult, if not impossible, to actually understand. So to know whether people are more promiscuous today than in the past, it's a very difficult question to ask. Why do you think that is?
People in the past probably weren't very open about whether they were being promiscuous in certain countries at least.
Yeah, that essentially like there's a quietness from the past on it, right? Are people actually reporting their real behavior? It's a sort of a big question, right? Why else might it be a difficult question to ask? Why else? So one of the people of the past might have been more quiet. Why is it difficult to understand if people are more sexually promiscuous today than in the past, or are? Just looking for guesswork. Yeah.
Is it something that was less talked about? Or more difficult to talk about than it was 50 years ago?
So maybe, yeah, that's kind of connected. Is it more difficult to talk about? What do we consider promiscuous? What's socially acceptable sexual behavior and what isn't changes as well, you know? So like, it's more, I think a more useful question is to ask, what forms of sexual practices do people do? What forms of intimate partner relationships did people have in the past versus today? And what might actually cause the changes, right? So, because if we think about it, there's a lot of things that we don't normally think of. Like, so you hear a lot of things about, you know, homosexuality, cohabitation, things like that, what people will often use to talk about people being more promiscuous today. But on other measures, it's not true, right? So like the percentages for things like hiring a prostitute are significantly lower than they were for your parents' generation, or your grandparents' generation, or your great-grandparents. So as you go back in history, men were more likely to have bought prostitutes in the past. Most people who are young today never will, right? So it's a practice that, one, like people have become just more hostile to culturally, right? It feels exploitative to hire prostitutes, right? Another example would be something like sexual assault, like very well possibly. It's hard to say what happened in the past, but it's certainly less culturally accepted than it was 20 or 30 years ago, where it was generally thought of as a fine behavior to engage in. So there's that. There's things like extramarital affairs, right? People were more likely to cheat on their spouse in the past than they are today. In fact, throughout the 20th century, we see declines in extramarital affairs. In fact, today, if you were to guess, what population do you think is most likely to engage in having, age-wise, to engage in an extramarital affair? Anyone want to guess?
Like upper middle-aged people?
55 and above. So you think about that, right? I mean, basically what I want to say is that like social structure causes certain forms of sexual behavior, some of which we're comfortable with, some of which we're not. And understanding the impetus behind that change is more important. Has anyone ever heard of the Kinsley report, by the way? This is something, has anyone ever heard of this? It's the biggest study on, it was done in the 40s and 50s. It's still to this day the biggest study on human sexuality ever done. Kinsley interviewed 18,000 people. He didn't give a survey to 18,000 people. He sat down and interviewed for like 2 hours, 18,000 people. And asked detailed questions about all of their sexual behavior. So it remains a very controversial book because what he found is in this period, so this is in the 40s and 50s, which normally we think of as what in terms of sexuality? A pretty closed time, right? We usually think of that as a time where people generally followed the rules. When people look back as some sort of period where people were more moral, usually in their mind they think of in the 50s, right? Yet there's things that are exceptionally common that we wouldn't really think of, right? And a lot of those statistics that I was saying came out of that, right? You also get things like it's very common for heterosexual men to engage in homosexual acts before the age of 20. Like people who grew up in the early 20th century, right? And so, okay, so we think about that, right? And so essentially what I want to ask is, and my article to some degree is asking in terms of certain types of sexual relationships, is what is changing? What do we see? So, okay. So with that as a sort of getting us into it. So when I go over time, let me know. That clock doesn't work and I can't get the computer to work right now, so I have no clue what time it is. What time is it, Bob? 3:30. What's that? 3:30. It's 3:30. Okay, good. We have a little bit. Thank you. Okay, so what's the changes that our article's seeing? Once again, this is the Tillman, Brewster, and Holloway's Sexual and Romantic Relationships in Young Adults. What are some of the changes you saw in the article?
I think it showed that we have pretty similar levels of sexual activity at a young age as compared to the past, but we have much later rates of we get married at an older age.
Yeah, that is both good points. So the first one, when do how do they define sexual activity? Did you catch that?
I don't want to talk about it.
You don't want that?
It's really personal, man. Reading all that,
We can, it's intercourse, right? So, sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Yeah, so he defines it on the basis of intercourse. So did anyone catch the average age?
Oh, 17.
17. So most people become sexually active at the age of 17. And that was actually true, this has been pretty consistent. So that was pretty true back in the early 20th century. It's pretty true today. So we've been pretty consistent in when sexual activity occurs. When did people in the mid to early 20th century get married? 20. Okay, first of all, just to point this out, what does this probably mean about people's first sexual experiences even in the early 20th century? The average age of sexual activity is 17, and the average age of marriage is 20 to 25.
That was like before marriage.
Yeah. So we are talking premarital for both eras. When are we likely to get married? Not we, I don't know why I included. When are people? I mean, I fit the statistic, but when are people who grew up in the latter half of the 20th, last part of the 20th century and into the 21st century, what age do they get married?
20s, early 30s?
Yeah. 25 to 30. Okay. So what that means is that we have today a longer period between initial sexual activity and the age of marriage. Right? So basically what happens. So what does that mean in terms of sexual activity? What do you think? What sort of things are likely to increase as a result of this change? There's a lot of things that our article points out for this. What changes? What things are more common today, more accepted culturally today than they used to be?
For most people to get college degrees and wait until marriage, wait until after that to get married.
I'm going to bracket that because then we're going to get into the causes. I'm just saying surely it forms of sexual activity or intimate partner relationships. What things are more common than they used to be? What's gone up?
Single parenthood.
How might this relate to single parent life? Why would this distance relate to single parent life?
Because if you are sexually active at 17 and it's only a 3 to 5 year gap between getting married, then it can just that's time usually about the time you go to college, which usually you can cover up. Or if it's later, like in your 30s, that's a greater time span. So you have a greater chance of getting pregnant and being parent.
Yeah. Essentially, it's increasing the length of time that you're sexually active before marriage increases the probability of you becoming a single parent, right? Birth control isn't 100% effective. So the longer period of time is practiced, right? What else? What else has gone up? Another good one is the number of premarital sexual partners. Right? The number of premarital sexual partners increased. Depending on who you talk to when it comes to sex studies, I think this is really interesting. The number of partners that people have over their life course hasn't really changed much. Which is really interesting. So you think about, like I said in the past, extramarital affairs are more common. So when people are getting married younger, they don't necessarily have less sexual partners, but they are more likely to engage in an extramarital affair. Which actually kind of makes sense if you think about the kinds of marriages people had in the past, right? They often got married really, really young. They didn't know what kind of person they were necessarily marrying, right? They didn't necessarily make as wise choices in marriage. Like, when you get married at 30 and you've dated like 7 people, like, you kind of like generally know the sort of person you're compatible with, right? So people's marital satisfaction, particularly for women, was a lot lower in the past than it is today. Which actually kind of makes sense that people would have a tendency not to have extramarital affairs in that situation, right? Okay. Another thing that you hear people talk about a lot, which is true, cohabitation increases. Cohabitation increases. So our author isn't just interested in these trends. So the trends are obviously interrelated, right? But it's interested in what causes these trends. So you started to hit on one already. Do you remember what you said earlier that I said that's the cause?
Now it's more acceptable for every gender to go to college, and people tend to not get married before they graduate from college.
So you have college. So increased rates for women, right? With female participation. In general, it's higher, right? So that is something that we could say. So female participation in the economy, as well as in college, is higher. So that has a tendency to drive marriage further down the line, right? By the way, do most people plan on getting married still today? This is an interesting statistic. Yeah, by and large, people still want to get married. They just don't really know when they're going to do it. Right? So it's become a more complex, the statement was it's become a more complex route. Right? Earlier there was a fairly simplistic step. Getting married was like getting your first job. It was something that was sort of preordained when you were going to do it. People generally did it at that time. Now we have a far more complex path to marriage. But most people still, when you interview them, and actually probably close to proportionate to what it used to be, the people wanting to get married hasn't really declined. People are less likely to get married than they were in the past, but that's not necessarily because they don't want to. It's because they don't. Okay, so we have people attending college. Why aren't you guys married yet? Most of you are in college, right? It would be unwise. What else? What other changes do we have that the article points to? What else do you get from college? So you get an education, which increases part of the reason why more people go to college is the wage gap between people who have a college degree and those who don't is increased over time. I know that if you talk to some people, they'll tell you that that's not true, but it is. So having a college degree is a pretty big, significant wage gap.
I would say financial stability.
Yeah, what kind of world are you guys going to, not to be depressing, but what kind of world are you guys going to step out into when you finish your degree, economically speaking? What are you going to have from college other than your degree? Yeah. People in their 20s have a lot higher debt than people in their 20s did 30 years ago. You know, a good chunk of your income will go to paying off your debt. Actually, probably not ever paying off your debt, but paying interest on your debt until they forgive it 20 years later. By the way, I like to just point this out, I may have said this before, when you graduate, income contingent repayment. It's the only thing you should sign up for. That way if you lose your job, you don't get all of a sudden get saddled with more debt, right? Income contingent, allow how much you pay in your debt to be determined by your income. Anyways, financial stability, you have a lot of debt, right? What else? Something hasn't gone up in 15 years. Does anybody know what it is?
think employment wages.
We have wage stagnation. And this is true of professionals. You know, the wages of people even in my profession, right? So professors' wages are actually lower than they were in the 1980s, right? What's gone up since the 1980s?
Housing?
Yeah, housing. What else?
Everything?
Food, right? Housing, food, clothing costs, like material costs. Like in the last 20 years, we've seen an increase, right, in the cost of living, but the wages have stagnated. So what does this mean for how? So our author wants to posit these sort of economic changes as the causes. How does that? How do you think that interrelates? What's being pointed at here? Why would that? What would that have to do with prolonged periods of not being married?
Because now people would like to be financially stable before they get married.
Yeah, it takes you longer to be financially stable enough to marry. Once you do get married, what do you usually have to wait for even longer today? So you have children, right? So if you decide to have children, if children is something, right, usually that takes even longer. Because in essence, like, there's a whole discussion about, so the earlier form of marriage, we have this sort of breadwinner narrative. We've looked at that before even in this class, right? And that's disappeared, right? So like the idea of a primary breadwinner, part of that is that women have gained the ability to participate in the economy. But part of it is also that, like, can you generally run a household on one income anymore? No. Right? So basically the idea is, what our author's trying to claim is, if you want to understand these phenomena, it's easier to understand them in the historical context in which they happen. So it's not that all of a sudden people got more amorous and do whatever they want. Right? That's how we want to talk about it. But what we're really seeing is that people have always, to some degree, acted upon their sexual desires, but the way in which that looks is vastly different depending on the institutional context in which it occurs. And that's kind of what the author's trying to say. Does that make sense? Cool. Questions or thoughts? You all have. Okay, well, we have one more article that we're going to talk about. So this is going to be next Monday. So next Monday we'll talk about another article. We'll have 2 sets of presentations on Wednesday, one on Wednesday, one on Friday. And then that'll be our last article. That we're going to talk about gerontology. So gerontology is basically the study of being elderly.
What?
It's the study of being elderly. So we will